Cold agglutinin disease, CAD, the complement system, and ENJAYMO, sutimlimab. In this video, we will briefly review the complement system, how CAD affects the complement system, and how ENJAYMO works. The complement system, also known as the complement pathway, is part of the innate immune system and functions primarily as a first-line host defense against pathogenic invaders. The major functions of the complement system include inflammatory cell recruitment, the body's response to infection or tissue injury; pathogen opsonization, the marking of the surface of pathogens for destruction; pathogen lysis, the breakdown of infectious organisms; and immune clearance, the removal of apoptotic cells from the body. The complement system is composed of three distinct pathways: classical, lectin, and alternative. Each pathway is distinguished by the trigger that activates it. The classical pathway is initiated typically by antigen-antibody complexes upstream at the C1 complex. The lectin pathway is initiated when various lectin complexes are activated by binding mannose-binding lectin, or MBL, on pathogens. The alternative pathway is initiated by factors B and D, which activate upon spontaneous hydrolysis of C3 on pathogens. The three distinct pathways converge with formation of C3 convertase enzyme downstream. In cold agglutinin disease, activation of the classical complement pathway occurs when autoantibodies called cold agglutinins, typically IgM, bind to the I antigen on red blood cells. Cold agglutinin disease, or CAD, is a rare chronic autoimmune hemolytic anemia characterized by C1-activated hemolysis, which is a result of classical pathway activation and persistent complement activation. In CAD, cold agglutinins, primarily IgM autoantibodies, mistakenly bind to red blood cells, or RBCs, at temperatures less than or equal to 37 degrees Celsius. IgM autoantibodies are potent classical complement pathway triggers. The C1 complex, which is made up of subcomponents C1q, C1r, and C1s, is recruited by the cold agglutinin complex and activated upstream by C1s in the classical complement pathway. Continued C1 activation of the classical complement pathway by cold agglutinins leaves patients in a chronic hemolytic state with serious and unpredictable consequences. Classical pathway activation is often assessed by measuring circulating levels of activated C4. The predominant form of chronic hemolysis in CAD is extravascular hemolysis, which occurs in the liver, where C3b-coated cells are phagocytized by macrophages. Intravascular hemolysis mediated by MAC occurs minimally due to intact regulatory proteins CD55 and CD59. Persistent complement activation can also result in a pro-inflammatory state via generation of anaphylotoxins C3a and C5a. ENJAYMO, the first and only approved treatment for cold agglutinin disease, also known as CAD, inhibits C1-activated hemolysis upstream in the classical complement pathway. ENJAYMO, sutimlimab, is indicated for treatment of hemolysis in adult patients with cold agglutinin disease. ENJAYMO, a monoclonal antibody, targets the C1 complex, which is composed of the subcomponents C1q, C1r, and C1s. Specifically, ENJAYMO inhibits complement protein component 1, S subcomponent, or C1s, in the C1 complex. C1s is a serine protease responsible for activating the classical complement pathway. By blocking C1s, ENJAYMO prevents downstream activation of the classical complement cascade and deposition of complement opsonins on the surface of RBCs, as well as generation of pro-inflammatory anaphylotoxins. Inhibition at C1s prevents the enzymatic action at the C1 complex, thereby addressing the underlying cause of hemolysis in CAD. The targeted inhibition of C1-activated hemolysis by ENJAYMO, in turn, inhibits extravascular hemolysis, the predominant form of hemolysis in CAD. It also inhibits intravascular hemolysis further downstream. By targeting C1s upstream in the classical pathway, ENJAYMO specifically inhibits downstream classical pathway activity. Meanwhile, ENJAYMO retains the important immune surveillance functional activities of the lectin and alternative pathways. Inhibit chronic C1-activated hemolysis upstream in the classical complement pathway by choosing ENJAYMO, the first and only approved treatment for cold agglutinin disease.